Hello, my name is Nigel Griffiths. I work in Advanced Technical Support for Power Systems IBM Europe. In this Director6 for AIX movie, we're going to look at my top 10 hints for getting Director6 up and running for some early success. So what do we mean by early success? Well, Director6 is a fairly large product. It will take some time to learn it, and you can get into some problems if you try and take some shortcuts or try some difficult things to start with. So we want to make sure that you try the easy things first on the easy configurations, get some success, some experience of how it actually works before you look at some of the trickier areas. So here's my top 10 hints. We'll go through these briefly in the next 10 foils. We'll come back to this slide at the end. My first hint is to go and watch the movies. There are 15 or 16 movies out on the internet now, and it's a very good way of getting an idea of how Director works, how it looks, how to actually operate it. There is no point in reading long manual pages about how a graphical user interface works. You need to either sit with somebody using it or watch somebody in a movie. There are two places for the movies, one in the Director website and there's another one in the AIX Wiki website which has some movies. I recommend you go and have a look at a lot of those. Hint 2 is that in our modern Power 5 and Power 6 machines we have our micro partitions where we have shared CPUs. At the bottom here we have somebody using a dedicated CPU. There's CPU not being used in there, it's wasted. Then we have these shared CPUs and their CPU flows between the different logical partitions. Now all this unused area at the top, that's ideal for Director use, isn't it? We can make Director perhaps a low priority compared to production use logical partitions, and we can use some of that CPU time. We can also ask Director to do things perhaps at 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock in the middle of the night, and so we can soak up some of that CPU power that we otherwise wouldn't be using. Tip number 3 is when we're installing our Director6 server into a logical partition, I recommend you dedicate a logical partition to its use, and assuming that you've got less than 500 endpoints, an endpoint is a copy of AIX or a VIO server or a HMC, then we can use the default Derby database that's built into the Director6 package. If you have a lot more endpoints than that, then perhaps when we're trying this early success, we're trying a prototype. And of course the prototype is unlikely to have more than 500 endpoints in it. Now you can look at the documentation to find out the minimum requirements, but here are mine to avoid some problems. First of all, allocate 2 CPUs. These will be shared CPUs, so that we're not dedicating them to Director6 use. It will use them, and when Director6 isn't doing anything, particularly if you're not logged in and it's not running its background jobs, then it doesn't actually use a lot of CPU power, then we can use those in other logical partitions. I would though make sure that this logical partition can go to 2 or maybe 3 CPUs. I've seen Director, when it's busy, actually take up 2 to 2.5 CPUs worth of power. The next point is that I recommend you use 4 GB of memory. Officially you can use less, but then you have to make sure you've got paging space set up. And I got into some tricky situations where we ran out of virtual memory and then things got very sticky. So start off with 4 GB of memory, then monitor your use. You may want to take that down later on. The next thing is that despite what it says in the documentation that you can install Director6 into about 4 or 5 GB of disk space, you should not do that. You should allow 50 or more gigabytes of disk space. The problem you have is that although you may be able to install server in just a few gigabytes of disk space, each time you decide to do an upgrade of a copy of AIX, it will bring down all those packages to the Director6 server before moving those to the NIM server that will actually do the work. And of course, if you bring down a copy of AIX 5.3 technology level 10, you'll find this is 4 or 5 gigabytes of space. And if you're updating 4 or 5 different versions or technology levels of AIX, you'll rapidly eat into 50 gigabytes of space. I've also seen Director, don't forget it has a database underneath the covers, actually on a single disk use it 100% busy for minutes at a time. So again, I recommend trying to spread out your I/O across at least a few disks. You can do that either with the VIO server using a micro partition and virtual disks, or we can use the SanDisk to actually spread out the I/O to boost our I/O rates. Also, when we're thinking about getting our logical partition ready, make sure you download Director early. You'll find that this new version is out at the end of 2009. It comes in at 1.6 gigabytes. Do download it early because it can take some time, and do make sure that you've set your U limit so you won't hit the 1 gigabyte file limit and your download will stop at that point. Now, tip number 4 is about the endpoints or the clients for Director6, and I don't want you to make things too hard for yourself. I've done this and gone into lots of problems, so I want you to avoid them. Don't use really old versions of the software. For example, AIX 5.1 and 5.2 won't work at all. Don't even go there. Also, don't use the extremely new versions of perhaps AIX. For example, if a new technology came out on a Monday, don't try and connect it to Director on the Tuesday. Typically, the Director6 test team will get the officially released version when that's done, put that into their test center, and then start testing. And if there are any problems, they'll produce the bug fixes at that point. I strongly recommend that you upgrade all your HMCs to 7.3.4 anyway, and I strongly recommend that for Director6. There are some problems with earlier versions of the HMC talking to Director6 that you'll completely avoid if you do that. Similar with the VIO servers, most people put in dual VIO servers, so there isn't really a big problem with upgrading. And I recommend this May 2009 or October 2009 versions of the VIO server because they have some nice features in here that can help out Director6. On the AIX side, the oldest version of AIX 5.3 that is supported is technology level 6 with all the service packs, but I don't recommend that you go there. Come back one level to technology level 7 with, again, all the service packs. Now, it's a little unfortunate that we can actually use Director6 to install the service packs, but I want you to start at a version that is fully supported. So technology level 7, 8, 9 or 10 are all happily put all the service packs that are available on them, and then start using Director6 with them, and then perhaps use Director to update from TL7 to TL8 or 9 or 10. Then you're likely to have a much more success. Similar thing with Director talking to AIX6. All the versions are supported, and again I recommend going for the full service packs, particularly the first service pack at any technology level. Put all the service packs available on it, then start using Director. Now, when you try Director to do updates or you're using VM Control Image Manager, they will need a NIM server, and it's your responsibility to create the NIM server, and then you might as well start with the very latest version of AIX because the NIM server has to be at the latest version that you want to actually manage. And there's a point there that I'm told that you can use the Director6 Update Manager and the VM Control can actually share the NIM server. You don't need two separate ones. Hint number 5 is very easy. This is your reason for having a big screen. Part of Director allows you to have these topology views that sees how things are connected, the machines are connected, the virtual disks and virtual networks are connected in your infrastructure. These maps can get very complicated if you've got lots of machines being managed by Director and you need a big screen. I've got a 5.5-inch screen here on my ThinkPad. It is not big enough to have a look at the topology views. You need a big screen on your desk. So you can go to your manager, or if you work at home, you can go to your partner and insist that this is the region Nigel says you have to have a 24-inch screen on your desk. Number 6 is that the HMC, if we've gone for a very recent version, it has the Director support built in. There's nothing you have to do to the HMC to actually allow that, as long as it allows you to connect to it. The VIO server, recent versions have the common agent already installed, as you did the install of the VIO server, but you do have to switch on this common agent. And here are the two commands you use to start the agent and to make sure it starts when you reboot. Now, tip number 7 is about the AIX and the common agent. In Director, you can see lots of references to going agentless or using the platform agent or the L2 legacy agent. None of that applies to AIX. You have to install the common agent. No ifs or buts. The others just will not work. In fact, in Power Systems terms, the platform agent is actually the HMC, and that is already pre-installed. If you're using IVM, then the IVM VIO server logical partition is the platform agent too. So if you installed AIX 6.1 technology level 3 or 4 and a fresh install, it will already have installed the common agent for you. You might have seen some references to something called the LWI, the lightweight infrastructure starting and stopping as you start and stop AIX. If you did an update from an earlier version of 6 to the TL3 or 4, it won't include it, of course, because it's doing an update. Otherwise, you have to go and install the common agent onto each of your endpoints. And I strongly recommend that you do that as a matter of course. In fact, Director6 will not actually find or communicate with just a straight copy of AIX. It will only talk to the common agent. Point number 7 is that you do need to prepare your NIM server. In the documentation for Director, it just refers you to the, I don't know what it is, but say 2,000 pages of NIM manual on how to do that, and it doesn't give you the specifics of what do you really need to do to NIM to get it ready to talk to Director. This has been improved in something called the Red Wiki. This is where the new documentation, or when things are missing, the documentation is put into the Red Wiki and will eventually find its way into the proper documentation. I use the Easy NIM setup to create a standard copy of NIM, and then I use, there's 3 or 4 commands you have to use, some of them on the NIM server and some on the client. The copy of AIX that you want NIM to start controlling, it's only then that you can actually do updates to the endpoint, the AIX endpoint, because it'll actually use the NIM server, but it has to be already set up as a NIM client to do that. The next thing to note, and I've only recently found this out really, is that you need to start from the top and work your way down. When I initially started, I had a Director server and I connected a copy of AIX to it. I then started looking at other AIXs and eventually VIO servers. But that's not the way you should be doing it. We should be discovering the HMC. Once we find it, we give access to it, and once that's okay, we do an inventory and we check the inventory finished satisfactorily. There's no errors in it. Then we go down to the VIO server. Then we go down to the logical partitions running AIX, and finally I recommend that you then do the NIM server. That is a copy of AIX, and then you can identify that as a NIM server rather than just a copy of AIX, and you'll be doing that either in the updates manager. You have to name your NIM server, or if you're using VM control, then you have to install the VM control agent on your NIM server in addition. Point number 10 then is run inventory on everything every night. Things will get very confusing and frustrating if you haven't got up-to-date inventories on your endpoints when you want to do things like updating them. So again, as we said very early on, we can use the Director6 to go and do inventories at set times, perhaps every day on some sort of schedule. You can group them together, perhaps do some of them at 1 o'clock, some at 2, and some at 3 o'clock in the morning. Particularly if you know those are quiet periods on your machines, you might as well do something useful so that every day when you arrive, all the inventories are up to date and things will work a lot smoother. So here's my starter for 10 then. Go watch the movies, you get into the mindset of how this works. Micro partitions are ideal. On the server, 2 CPUs, virtual CPUs of course, 4 gigabytes of memory, 50 gigabytes of disk space or more, and make sure you've got a couple of disks in there at least. And try and get that right first time and you get a nice simple install. On the clients, use recent versions and do include those service packs if you want early success. A nice big screen on the VIO server. Don't forget to start the common agent. On AIX you must have the common agent installed and up and running. Make sure you prepare that NIM server before you try doing updates or using VM control image manager. Top down, start at the HMC VIO server and work down to the rest, making sure you do discover, get access and inventory, and make sure your inventories are up to date every night. There are some areas that I want you to avoid if you want early success, and there are 4 of them in particular. First of all is that the director would like access to the internet. It goes to the IBM web pages, for example, things like Fix Central, and pulls down information about what are the latest releases of AIX technology levels, for example, the firmware, the HMC, those sorts of things. And then it can offer you those as potential updates on your machines or your logical partitions. Now you can capture that information and pull it to the machine and import it into Director, but of course that is much more complicated and makes early success harder to actually achieve. So in your initial trials I recommend that you organise to have direct access to the internet to avoid those things. Next is that you cannot use multiple NIM servers. The update manager or VM control, you tell it about one NIM server and it uses that. And I wouldn't go sharing this NIM server if you have one already in your infrastructure. I'd create a new NIM server solely for the use of Director. Director also likes very simple networks. Between the server and the endpoints, it just assumes that it can instantly connect to it and do what it wants. If you have a more complicated network, you could get into problems. If you've got lots of VLANs, for example, or you need particular routes, or you've got firewalls in here that will block particular ports, then you can run into lots of problems with Director losing contact with the endpoints or not being able to find them at all. So again, with your initial early success, try and go for a very simple single subnet if you can network and avoid all those problems. We can tackle those later on once you've had some early success. Another area is that Director doesn't have high availability. Now Director of course is a systems management tool, and if Director is not available, then all your machines will carry on running. And if you like, we already have a fallback option, because if Director is not available, we still have the HMCs or the IVMs. You can still log on to your VIO servers and copies of AIX and do things as you have in the past. So we have a built-in, if you like, a high availability in that sense. If you become dependent on Director, then you need to think about some more high availability features. Director6 manuals include lots of information about how to back up your Director databases, and then you need to think about, if we lose the logical partition running Director, how long would it take us to actually recover that? We'd create a logical partition again if necessary. We can pull the backup up and go back to last night's position and carry on running Director. If you need to be faster than that, then perhaps you want to think about having a cold backup with that machine with the latest backup on it, and you could use that to bring Director back up in a different logical partition if necessary. Now I'll leave you with the places where to go and get information. The Director website is fairly obvious to go and find that. The 2 places for movies are either from that Director website, or there's another one in the with other movies on in the AIX Wiki movie database. We have a link there to the documentation, and there's a lot of that in there. And we can also find out that latest information, particularly with the NIM server as an example, and other bits of missing information get put into this red wiki, and you can go there. Now I do note that you need that -01 in the URL for that to actually work. Well, I hope that's been useful and you can have some early success with Director.